Hi everyone, welcome. What you see here is a batch of worm castings that I, at this point, pretty much consider as harvested. And the worms that used to live in this stuff have been relocated into 3 yellow buckets that we're going to get around to feeding once we're finished here. But what we're doing here is attempting to round up any straggler worms that weren't successfully rounded up during the main haul out by setting up this little bait box. The bait box is a batch of nice, fresh bedding material, and it's been maintained in such a way that I come in every so often just to give it a little squirt, a little refresher of the moisture content that it has. And there was some food placed in there too. And the hope is that the material here, being uncovered, will gradually get a little bit drier over time, and that the worms will want to move out. So the stuff out on the surface, being a little bit drier, is the stuff that the worms don't want to be in. But the stuff that's down low is a little bit damp still, protected by the depth, basically, of the material. So every time I do one of these attempts at, baiting and rounding up straggler worms out of a batch of finished castings, I always want to come in here periodically to stir in the drier material that's floating out on the surface, that's had a chance to kick off some of its moisture to evaporation, blending it in with the more damp stuff down below, and in that same vein, bringing the damp stuff that's down low up closer to the surface where it too has a chance to have some of its moisture content removed. So the original haul out of the worms and the harvest of these castings occurred 2 weeks ago. 14 days now have passed since the system has been set up this way, and it was on day 10, 4 days ago, that I came in here to do the exact same thing we're doing now, which is just to do a quick aeration of the material, and as I mentioned earlier, just a combining of the dry stuff out on the surface with the rest of the material down low. And I just can't seem to resist grabbing any worms that I encounter along the way. I do like one of the estimates that I got from one of the viewers, which was that, at least in that person's estimation, that it did appear to them, just based on our look through this material then, 2 weeks ago, it was their thinking that it's pretty likely that we did manage to round up and haul out probably, gosh, I should have refreshed my memory by looking at what the comments said, but I thought it was something like, a really high percentage was thought to have already been successfully hauled out of this material, which was maybe 99%. If that is true, and then we've left behind only 1% of the worms that were originally occupying these castings, and our attempt at getting the worms to voluntarily exit this material was clearly successful. We used the method of horizontal migration, trying to convince the worms to exit their material by nudging the material off to one side of the bin and setting up the opposite end of the bin with nice fresh bedding and food. And that process, it's a little time consuming. You got to be patient. It's not the fastest way to separate worms from their castings, but it certainly does seem to work well, or at least here it did, and I've had good luck with it in the past. So I just wanted to go through this one more time, 4 days after I did it last, to once again aerate and combine material, and I guess, as you already saw me do on a couple occasions, manually haul out any worms that I encounter. But it's pretty obvious that there's not many. We do seem to have a batch of castings here that are, for the most part, depopulated. So let's restore this to the state that it was in when we started, which was just getting the bait box situated back in this material. Any of you who were with me in the last video will probably remember that this bait box was oriented this way, and I forgot. This is the way I'll normally do it, but I thought that if I were to do it this way, that we'd have a greater surface area that would allow for a greater amount of evaporation and drying. So that's the reason I've opted to reorient the bait box to see if we can get a more optimal drying effect. So alrighty, let's get this thing back up on the shelf, and then we can proceed to giving the wormies in the buckets their first feeding since the launch of the bin. It's really going to be feeding number 2 because the bins were pre-fed when the worms were placed in them. So let's make that happen now. So now that batch of castings that we were just working on, that was the castings that came from the harvest of 2 bus bins in which these European night crawlers lived previously. And after we did the haul out, we launched 3 buckets, so I've got 3 systems to feed here. And since that's the case, I just happen to have 3 old whole wheat pitas here that are a little bit old, and one of them, no, I think all 3 of them got a little bit soggy. And I think that might even be some mold right there growing on it. Not too surprising, when bread gets soggy, it sometimes tends to get moldy as well. So that's going to be their feeding for the day. These buckets, before we launched the worms into them 14 days ago, had a portion of food dropped in there as sort of a little bit of a welcoming treat for them. And I'm not sure what to expect as far as leftovers, but we're going to probe down into the material a little bit. I got to tell you, the material has this really nice, fluffy, soft consistency to it. A lot of my systems have this tendency to perhaps get a little bit overly damp and muddy, and then the material starts to clump together, and it is a little bit of a treat when I encounter castings that feel the way they're supposed to, which is like what I'm spotting here. And a lot of these castings really did just sort of come over with the worms from their old home. And their old home was really just the horizontal migration feeding zones of their old systems that they used to occupy. So besides a whole bunch of fresh bedding and food that was waiting in these buckets for them when they were launched, the worms were released into here with a good bit of familiar material that they were occupying. And I thought that it might be nice just to let them venture into the new material at their own leisure as they start to get comfortable with it, rather than doing what I've done in the past, which is to really go to extra efforts to separate the worms from the material that they're in and then launch worms only into a brand new environment. So I was trying to decide how to put this in here, and it does seem sensible to bust it up into a few little pieces. And some of it is a little bit dry too, starting to become stale. But I also want to do another thing that I generally do when I place bread products into my worm bins, which is to introduce a little bit of supplementary moisture to complement the bread. So that's what we're doing here, spraying in a little bit of moisture. I wonder if perhaps I could have just dampened these pitas by soaking them in some water before feeding. Well, not terribly important. I think we'll be okay here. Let's get this system wrapped up, because we've still got 2 more buckets to feed. And like I've mentioned in the past, I usually treat the first of multiple systems that are the same age and configured the same way. I treat it as sort of an exploratory type approach to the feeding of the first of multiple bins like this. or multiple buckets in this case. But then I usually approach the feeding of any subsequent brother bins or sister bins or twin bins in more of a production line method, with the assumption that we're probably dealing with another system here that's very similar to the one that we just worked on. So I'm going to be picking up the pace a little bit here and trying to, let's get this one out of the way, trying to save a little bit of time rather than prolonging the process. Okay. So far, I do feel like we're encountering a very similar situation. One thing I did not notice, though, when we probed through bucket number 3, these are the buckets that I've got labeled as buckets number 3, 4, and 5. So bucket number 3, to me, did not really show any signs of leftover foods. The feeding of these buckets was not shown in the video last time, so it's not captured for posterity, and I don't remember what I placed into these systems as their food. But whatever it is, they must have either really liked it or maybe they were just really hungry. So I don't think we've encountered anything that would classify as leftovers from the last feeding. But who knows? Maybe we did and I just glossed over it. Alright. Like I said, I really didn't intend to spend a great deal of time down in here. The other thing that I did include with the setup of these bins... Oh, you know what? I think we just found a clue. I see cantaloupe melon rinds. And whether these were what was fed, or if that was just material that came over with the worms from their old home, I couldn't tell you for sure one way or the other, but it is possible that what they were fed on feeding number 1 was melon rinds, and now for feeding number 2 it's basically whole grain bread. Okay. And that leads us to the last system that needs feeding. It's bucket number 5. Once again, approaching this with the expectation that should be very much the same as buckets number 3 and 4. If we were to encounter anything that really deviated, then I would be a little bit surprised, but certainly not out of the realm of possibility, so we do need to be prepared for the potential of that being the case. But it is nice to see that these systems appear to be pretty happy and healthy, and I really like the appearance of the castings that are accumulating in both systems. Everything feels nice and fluffy, and I'm not including any bedding with today's feeding, as some of you might have noticed. I usually assume that brand new systems like these have a fair abundance of bedding, so I don't sweat it too much. And that's part of the rationale for why I skipped it today, and I guess the other reason is that I sort of spaced out. I probably would have if I had thought this through a little bit more, but this was sort of a thrown together idea of, hey, why don't we go check in on those buckets? It's been 2 weeks since we launched them, and perhaps they're ready for a little bit of food. Once these chunks of bread begin to get moldy, it should attract the attention of the worms, and I guess in pursuit of what I think they like the best, it's the mold that develops on the bread, they'll probably consume the bread as well. And whether or not we're going to wait 2 more weeks until the next check-in, I don't know. I'll probably be back in to see how those castings are drying, to give them another aeration and tilling. And if I get to the point where I feel like we're not really encountering any more worms in that stuff, then we'll have to do that haul out of the bait box, and then we can write that batch of castings off as fully ready to be harvested and put to use. So before we end the video, I'd like to invite everyone to the previous video where we actually launched these systems. And it's in those videos that I usually ask the viewers to provide me with their input in terms of how many worms they thought they saw get launched. I'm still not releasing our estimates because it seems to me like a very few people have provided their input and their estimates on how many worms they think live in these systems. So I really would like to get that. So I'm going to include a link up in the corner of the screen, and that's where I'm going to ask that you go check out the previous video and at least look at the worms that were released and give me your estimates. I'd love to know what people think in terms of you know, how many worms each of these buckets has. And then at some point, once we got a good number of estimates and the responses to the video and the comments have settled down, I'll, you know, provide a announcement letting everyone know what we think as far as the estimated population of all these systems. So that's it for the video, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.